Imagine fighting for your freedom in court. And after years of fighting, the highest court in the country tells you that you don't even have the right to sue. That's what happened to a man named Dred Scott. In 1857, the United States Supreme Court handed down one of the most controversial decisions in American history. The case, Dred Scott versus Sandford. But here's the thing. Dred Scott's story isn't just about one of Supreme Court's cases. It's about slavery. It's about freedom. It's about citizenship. And it's about a man who refused to simply accept that the life he was living was the only life he could have. I'm your host, Miss Tay Nicole, and this is Let's Talk Black History. Now, let's get into the story. So, Mr. Dred Scott was born into slavery sometime around 1799 or 1800, but he was born in Virginia. He was eventually enslaved by Peter Blow family. Scott was later taken to Missouri, which at the time was a slave state. Eventually, Scott was purchased by Dr. John Emerson, an army surgeon, and this is where Dred Scott's story takes a major turn. Because Emerson's military assignment took him and Scott to places where slavery was prohibited. So Scott lived for periods of time in Illinois and later in Wisconsin territory. And this became incredibly important. Why? Because Scott was living in places where slavery was restricted or prohibited under federal law. The legal question became, if an enslaved person is taken into a free territory, can they become legally free? That question would eventually reach the Supreme Court. Dred Scott eventually returned to Missouri, but instead of simply accepting his continued enslavement, Scott decided to fight for his freedom in court. In 1846, Scott filed a lawsuit in Missouri seeking his freedom. And here's something important to understand. Scott wasn't the first enslaved person to use courts to fight for freedom. No. There was a legal tradition known as once free, always free. Once free, always free. The basic argument was that if an enslaved person who was taken into a place where slavery had been prohibited, that person could potentially become free. Scott's case initially failed on a technical issue, but he didn't give up. He tried again. And in 1850, a Missouri jury ruled in Scott's favor. For a moment, it looked like Dred Scott might finally be free. But the fight wasn't over. The Missouri Supreme Court later reversed that decision. Go figure. Scott continued fighting, though, did not give up. Eventually, his case made its way through the federal courts and all the way to the United States Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court, oh, the good old Supreme Court. March 6, 1857, the Supreme Court announced its decision in the Dred Scott versus Sandford court case. The court ruled against Dred Scott, of course. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney wrote the majority opinion, and the decision went far beyond simply deciding whether Dred Scott was free. The court, they declared that people of African descent who were enslaved and descendants from enslaved or former enslaved people could not be citizens of the United States under the Constitution. That meant the court said Scott did not have the legal standing ground to bring his case in federal courts. Now just ponder on that for a minute. Dred Scott had gone to court asking, "Am I free?" But the Supreme Court's answer initially became, "You don't have the right to bring this case amongst us because you're not considered a citizen." Now, ain't that about a bunch of bullshit? But the court also ruled that Congress could not prohibit slavery in federal territories in the way the Missouri Compromise had attempted to do. That means that the decision was even more explosive than what we know it to be. The Dred Scott decision shocked the country because for abolitionists and many people opposed to slavery, the decision was devastating. But it also intensified the political conflict between the nation's free and slave states. See, the country was already deeply divided over slavery, very deeply divided. The Supreme Court's decision did not resolve that conflict, it made it even worse. Just a few years later, the United States would descend into the Civil War. Now, the Dred Scott decision became one of the major events remembered when looking at the growing crisis over slavery and the future of the nation. And eventually, the legal system would move in a completely different direction. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, and the 14th Amendment, which established birthright citizenship and equal protection under the law. And see, those constitutional changes directly address some of the fundamental issues raised by Dred Scott's decision. But I know you're wondering, what happened to Dred Scott himself? Here's the part of the story that sometimes gets overlooked. After the Supreme Court made their decision, Scott was eventually sold to the Blow family, the same family that had enslaved him earlier in his life. And in May of 1857, just months after the Supreme Court decision, Dred Scott was granted freedom. His wife, Harriet Scott, was eventually freed as well. But unfortunately, Dred Scott didn't live long enough to see the Civil War or the abolishing of slavery, because he died in 1858. But his legal battle had already become part of American history. Hell, a big part. But see, Dred Scott lost his case. But losing that case didn't mean his fight was meaningless. It didn't mean the battle was over. His story exposed some of the deepest contradictions in American democracy. A country that spoke about liberty and freedom was still allowing millions of people to be enslaved. A constitution that promised rights was being interpreted in a way that denied those rights to an entire population. Dred Scott's case forced America to confront those contradictions, and eventually the nation would have to answer those contradictions. His story reminds us that sometimes history changes, or not because someone wins the first battle, but because their struggle forces the country to have a conversation it can no longer avoid. So tell me, what do you think? Did Dred Scott's fight for freedom help change America, even though he lost his Supreme Court case? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear your thoughts. And if you learned something today, if you learned something new, make sure you do me a big favor, and that's like this video, subscribe to my channel, and make sure you follow Let's Talk Black History with Tay Nicole, and share this episode with someone who should know this story but doesn't. Because Black history isn't just about celebrating the victories. Sometimes it's about remembering the people who fought, even when the system told them they couldn't win. Once again, I am Tay Nicole, and I'll see you in the next episode of Let's Talk Black History, because Black history is American history. Now, as always, stay peaceful, stay blessed, and let's stay black, baby. Peace out.